Recently now, there's been a lot of concern about the Vatican's investigation of American nuns. A lot of voices have been raised, concerned that this is just a oppressive move on the part of the church. I'll give you one example, a recent column written by Carol Marine, who's a writer for the Chicago Sun-Times. And she wrote a pretty strongly worded attack on this move. And she argued that this is just one more example of an out-of-touch patriarchal church coming down hard on women. And she adds that these are the people who, for many decades, took care of the great institutions of the church, the schools and the hospitals, who did a lot of the grunt work and for very little compensation. So why is the patriarchal church coming down, especially on these people? Well, I think her article is pretty much of a diatribe, and it represents a caricature. But with regard to any caricature, there's always a grain of truth. And there is truth here. What I mean is, I've spoken to a lot of, especially older nuns over the years, and I know there was a fair amount of sexism institutionally in the church. Go back, especially in the years before the council, where women were kind of institutionally excluded or put down in different ways. Too many priests did disrespect, I think, the work of nuns, and nuns have reacted to that. So I understand those feelings. That said, let me return to the caricature side of it. To characterize these religious women as a dirt cheap labor force for the church, I think overlooks a very important fact, that these are religious women who had voluntarily taken vows of poverty to live lives of total dedication for the sake of the church. In that regard, they're no different than thousands of men religious, Dominicans and Franciscans and Carmelites and so on, who made very similar vows and did the same kind of, if you want, grunt work for almost no compensation. So I think the imposition of the categories of oppressive male versus the oppressed female is just too simplistic. But none of that really gets to my principal objection to Carol Marine's article and to many of the objections that have been raised. The argument seems to be that it's simply an act of oppression and aggression on the part of a church that still doesn't get it. The male patriarchal church, again, just coming down hard, wanting to control those in inferior positions. Well, there's control and there's control. What I mean is, there is a kind of fussy intervention with the details of the life of the church. There's a fussy dominance that can happen. And I'd be as against that as anybody. But there's also a control that is simply an expression of the church's desire to maintain its own integrity. There are moves in the church sometimes that are repugnant to our own identity, our own mission and purpose. And the church has a very legitimate role in monitoring that and supervising. I think this investigation has much more to do with that latter category than the former. Now, let me give you just one piece of evidence on this, and there are many others that could be brought forward. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2007, a sister from Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, Sister Lori Brink, a Dominican, gave the keynote address at the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which is the largest and most important body for a religious leadership in the women's religious leadership in America. So she was speaking to a lot of the really key players in setting the tone for the life of nuns in America. And she laid out in this speech 4 models for women's religious life in the future. The first one was death with dignity. So she acknowledged that many groups of nuns are aging. The average age, I think, is about 70 in this country. And so some have opted for a kind of death with dignity. We will fade away and do so in the most respectful way. Second option, and she spoke of it with a certain amount, I think, of condescension, she called the model of acquiescence. These are nuns who have acquiesced with John Paul II's and Pope Benedict's call to go back to traditional forms of religious life, to go back to the habit, to work in schools and so on, and to live very much in conformity with the church's expectations. But she acknowledges that as a model for the future of religious life. A fourth one, a final one she mentions, she calls the path of reconciliation. And this is that nuns can play the role of reconciling many of the warring groups within the church, men against women, clergy against laity, liberals against conservatives, etc. Okay, with certain reservations, I would say, so far so good with those 3 models. I had no substantial objection. But then she describes a third option. She calls it the option of sojourning. And nowhere in the talk does she critique it as insufficient or inadequate. She never characterizes it as a problematic path. It's one of the viable options for women religious. Here's the path of sojourning. It represents those who have moved beyond the church, indeed beyond Jesus, who now are looking for spiritual wisdom in a wide variety of religious traditions and beyond the confines of the church and its traditions. She even quotes a sister approvingly who said that though her spiritual life began with Jesus, it now has moved beyond him. And she says this could represent the path that God is showing to us. This could represent a way forward. Well, as Tom Hanks would say in Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem. When I read the talk, I thought, no. Say what you want about the other three models. That model is simply inadmissible. How come? Because it disrespects who Jesus is. Jesus is not one religious figure among many. He's not one guru or teacher among many, beyond whom we could possibly go in a further quest for religious truth. Because the claim of the church, the ancient claim going back to the Gospel of John, is that Jesus Christ is in person the Logos. He is in person God's own mind, God's own self. We should respect religious insight, philosophical insight from a wide variety of cultures and perspectives. We can and should appreciate the wisdom found there, but we should appreciate it precisely as a reflection of Jesus Christ, who is himself the fullness of the Logos. If you say we can go beyond Jesus legitimately, then I've left behind that theology. Furthermore, if I say I can go beyond his mystical body, the church, I've also undermined that structuring logic of Christian faith. Now, does this speech represent the opinion of one person, or is it a very widespread point of view? Does it represent just Sister Brink's sort of peculiar perspective, or is it something which is now inspiring a lot of American religious women? Well, I think that's what the Vatican wants to find out. I think it's not simply an expression of males in the Vatican oppressing women. I think it's a legitimate interest in finding out how widespread this kind of opinion is. And I think as far as it goes, that's a valid concern.